Thanks for tuning in. Really appreciate it. Today on the show, we have a really great guest, Shannon Clare Petitt from MAPS and Zendo. I'm going to read the bio from MAPS website. Shannon received her master's in integral counseling psychology from CIIS in 2014 with a practicum working with youth on moderation management for drug and alcohol use. Her passions include working with addiction, trauma, relationship, the body, and nature. At MAPS, she serves as the Therapist Training Program Coordinator. She also leads community engagement for the Zendo project, bringing harm reduction services to events and expanding efforts for awareness and integration of psychedelic experiences. Shannon is a co-therapist in a MAPS-sponsored Phase 2 trial researching MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for anxiety associated with life-threatening illness. So that's it there. Well, she's also a California native, which is pretty neat. So Kyle does a bunch of work with Shannon through MAPS. Kyle's doing some volunteering, and I think Shannon is his primary contact, which is great. Really fun interview. Hope you like it. A lot of really good, insightful stuff and some really good science data and insight around what's happening there. If you want to support the show, just really tell your friends, share it with one or two friends, and I'm sure we have an episode out there that's interesting and or relevant to some people you know. Or you can leave a review on iTunes. Just takes a minute. Go to iTunes, go to the store, search Psychedelics Today, leave a rating. If you even want to go a step beyond, you can leave a review. Helps a lot, because that's how people find out about shows. If you go to the iTunes store, you're really not going to find us on any real listing. You have to kind of search. But the more reviews we get, the more people can find us naturally, and that just helps us get guests for you guys. Thanks again for listening, and really appreciate your time. Let us know if there's anything you want to ask us, or stuff you want us to check out, or people you want us to interview. Psychedelicstoday.com, the contact page there is the best way to reach out. Thanks again. Take care. Enjoy.
Welcome to the show, Shannon. Thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, really excited to chat about some of your work with MAPS and what you're involved in. But I guess first, I'd kind of like to know, how'd you get involved with MAPS? Like, what's your story behind getting into this field?
Yeah, I feel really fortunate. It's kind of a funny way I came to be working at MAPS, and I think it's an awesome job. So I feel really lucky to be in it. In 2011, I had just finished AmeriCorps, and I was in Santa Cruz. And so I was looking for another job. I knew I wanted to stay in that town, and I was looking on Craigslist, and I applied to dozens of jobs. And I came across this admin position at a place called MAPS. I'd never heard of it before. And I read up about it a little bit before my interview, and I went and had my interview. And the person who was interviewing me actually went to the same school, CIIS, that I was about to start going to. So I kind of had an automatic in. And I actually did know one of the staff members there. We had gone to college together at UC Santa Cruz. So I went and I did my interview. I was feeling pretty confident about it. And I walked outside the office. I was getting in my car to go home after the interview. And my old college mate walks out. And he was like, "Hey, so you're interviewing for our office position?" And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "Well, I hope you have your stuff together." But didn't say it quite as politely. And I was kind of stunned, like, I just did an interview and you're asking me if I have my shit together. And I got the job, and it proved that while MAPS is an amazingly creative and flexible and organic organization, and of course Rick is a charismatic leader, that the people running all the different programs and the administration really, I think even more than other organizations, have to be really on top of it about their organization. So I started working in the office. I was the receptionist. And then I became the office manager. I did accounting for a while. And I was Rick's assistant for about a year and a half. And I love the man, but that's about as long as you can be Rick's assistant. He's a wild one. My friend who's a business consultant calls him the psychedelic cowboy. So you can only imagine trying to organize such a creature.
Yeah.
And so about 2 years ago, I stopped assisting Rick, and I have been moving more into clinical work. Got my master's in counseling psychology at CIS. Started working as a co-therapist on one of the MAPS-sponsored studies, which is kind of a second job. I work as an independent contractor for the study site. And then my work at MAPS has transitioned to focus more on the MDMA therapy training program, where we're training other therapists and researchers to be able to work on MAPS-sponsored studies. And the other part of my job, there's lots of parts to it, is the Zendo project, which I'm sure we'll talk about, a psychedelic harm reduction effort. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. So that's funny. Did you have any interest in psychedelics before applying to MAPS? Like, did you know anything about it, or you just kind of saw this ad on Craigslist and decided to apply?
Yeah, I had some personal experiences before that were very impactful in my life. I wasn't all about psychedelics at that time. I mean, I did live in Santa Cruz. I did at one point have dreadlocks and a bunch of piercings. So I guess you can say it wasn't too far off the mark. But I really didn't think or have any clue at that time that pretty much my entire life would become about psychedelics. And even when I was working at MAPS and going to CIS simultaneously, I didn't really think that psychedelic psychotherapy was probably what I wanted to pursue. I was really interested in working with addiction. And I really wanted to work with prison population, and MAPS hasn't been doing those studies so much. So I kind of was thinking about moving into that direction. But as soon as I started my practicum and working with people doing talk therapy, I would have professors who would brag about seeing clients for like decades. Like, oh, I've had this client for 30 years. And I mean, on one hand, that's awesome. You know, it's like it's like people bragging about their marriage lasting that long. But on the other hand, I was like, oh no, I do not want to see clients for 30 years. Yeah. I want to see them and have them get better and have them go back to their lives. Mm-hmm. And so it was when I was actually doing clinical work that I realized in a very experiential way how much quicker psychedelic therapy would be able to help people. Yeah.
Awesome. Cool. Yeah, I always like to ask these questions for any students listening or people that might want to get involved, just to hear some stories about how people end up getting into the field. And, you know, ever since I've been interested in this, I'm like, oh man, MAPS would be like a great place to work. And yeah, it's just funny that you saw it on Craigslist and just applied. So something simple like that.
I know. So I suggest to everyone to keep checking the Santa Cruz Craigslist and the MAPS website for postings, because it is wild. There's so many thousands of people who are interested in this work and contact us all the time to work for us, to be a participant in a study, to volunteer for us, to come to music festivals with the Zendo project. And then when we do have an opportunity, it's sometimes hard for us. We're a relatively small staff. We have about 25 people now. When I started in 2011, it was about 10. So when we have an opportunity, it's like, okay, there's this opportunity that hundreds of people have been asking us for. And how do we tell people about it? How do we get it to the right people? So I really encourage people to just be persistent about coming to MAPS events and checking the website. And if you do that enough, opportunities will start to arise.
Awesome. Thanks. Yeah. And I think also with some of your other work, it might be a good avenue. So Joe and I, in the last episode, were kind of discussing the MDMA therapy training that I was just at with you and a couple other people in New York. And I wasn't too sure how much to talk about it. So I'm glad that you're here to kind of fill in some gaps that maybe I left out. But it seems like that might also be an avenue for therapists looking to get involved, is maybe getting involved in a therapy training. So what are the steps? Like, how are you guys reaching out to train people, I guess?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So obviously we have to train people to work on the studies before they can offer MDMA-assisted psychotherapy to subjects. We call them subjects. I know they're people, but that's just the lingo we use. And so Michael and Annie Mithofer have been our therapy team in Charleston, South Carolina. They've been doing clinical trials with MAPS for about 15 years or so. And so they've been leading the training. anytime we start a new study and need a new group of researchers to be trained. So, for example, I started working on the MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for anxiety associated with life-threatening illness study. It's a long title. Basically, we work with cancer patients who are having anxiety about their diagnosis. So my training took place in Canada about in 2014, and Michael and Annie led it, and they were training all the people who would work on that study, and also some folks who would start working on a study in Canada with PTSD. The training used to be just about 5 days. We would sit and we would watch videos of Michael and Annie doing therapy and their sessions, because we videotape all of the sessions and the studies. And we would pause the video and we would talk about different topics related to the treatment manual, non-directive therapy, and inner healing intelligence. And it was great. It was really intimate. There were, maybe 10 people there total. It was usually in somebody's house. But as we're moving through the phases of the research, we need to see more subjects, which means we need more therapy teams. And so we're having bigger and bigger trainings and more frequently. So this year we had 3 different training events. We have another one coming up in January again in New York. And right now the training is focused for preparing therapy teams for phase 3. So MAPS is moving through the different phases of clinical research. Phase 2 was about testing a particular treatment for a particular condition, so MDMA therapy for post-traumatic stress. Phase 3 is about reproducibility, so can you get those same effects? And we've been having phenomenal results. Can you get those same effects in a larger population so it's statistically significant? So our studies have been 18 to 24 people. Phase 3 is going to be 200 to 400 people. It's going to be a multi-site study. Sorry.
Is that total count of people?
Yeah.
200 to 400?
Yeah. Phase 2 per study has been about 18 to 24, and we've done a handful of phase 2 studies.
Okay.
And yeah, phase 3 altogether will be 200 to 400 subjects. Yeah. So that means about 60 to 80 people working as researchers on the therapy team. So it's quite a number. That's probably 3 times the number of people we've trained anytime in the past. So we developed the training program and really evolved it into a 5-part training where we have an online module. We have an in-person training, which is similar to that original 5 days. People do an outside workshop. We have a second time that they come and do a week together. And then they have ongoing supervision and evaluation of their progress. So it's been a big thing to develop and to manage. We're still developing content for some of the later parts of the training, which haven't happened yet. And at this point, we're just finishing training about 150 people. And of them, we will choose about half to actually work on phase 3. So the training program is a good time for us to really get to know people in person. And this is a very particular kind of therapy. And it's interesting because we need researchers who have experience working clinically with people with trauma. And yet a lot of people are taught pretty directive modes of therapy. So cognitive behavioral, or they have an agenda and they have a structure, and sometimes they have steps they go through to administer their modality of therapy. But our modality is much different. It's called non-directive. And so while we want people to have experience, they kind of have to have this process of unlearning and relearning. And so that's what we do in our training program. We also have trained people who are working on research studies that are not MAP sponsored. So there are other organizations that are doing MDMA studies. The Beckley Foundation in the UK, Johns Hopkins is looking at developing something there. And then we will apply for expanded access. So this is an FDA program after phase 3 starts. If there's such a demand, meaning that we have so many people contacting us to be a part of the study that we can't possibly see all of them, and we have long wait lists, we can appeal to the FDA for expanded access, which means we can see more people, we can train more therapists, we can have more sites DEA approved to meet that need. Expanded access wouldn't be a clinical research trial. It actually goes in conjunction with phase 3, and it happens in a therapist's or a psychiatrist's private practice. So people have to pay out of pocket for it. So it's different than the research that MAPS is doing, which of course we don't charge study subjects for. So we have had
Can we sit tight for a sec? I want to try to get Kyle back in.
Yeah.
I don't know how he dropped. Oh man. He just sent me a text. Well, I guess we can keep going while he's trying to get back on.
Okay.
So it's pretty interesting that it'll happen in a particular private practice. Do you think if expanded access happens, will it be the case that you'll need to follow a similar format with like a nurse in the room and checking blood pressure and all that stuff?
Yeah, we don't have to have a nurse in the room anymore. We did have to do that on our first couple of subjects. There does have to be a medical monitor. They don't have to be on site, but they do have to be available if the therapists have any issues. And then the only person who could administer the MDMA is a medical doctor who has a DEA Schedule 1 license. But we do blood pressure monitoring. Yeah, it's unclear how strictly the FDA would require people in expanded access to adhere to the model. They might say it has to be the exact same protocol where you have a male and a female co-therapist in the room and you take the blood pressure every half hour, and that the study subject stays the night, and that there's 3 integration sessions after each experimental. But there could be variations. Maybe they don't need to have 2 therapists. Maybe it can just be 1. Maybe they don't need to take blood pressure all day long. Maybe they don't have to stay the night at the study site, but can get a ride to go home.
Right. That's pretty neat. As much as it's cool to have like a single format for testing, it would be cool to be able to have data on multiple formats of the research.
Yeah, definitely. And while we like our model and we are seeing that it's working well, it's certainly not the only way, and it's not necessarily the best way. It's just the way that we've found works well, and we've evolved it over the years. And you're right that it does have to be consistent because it's research. So people ask us, well, what if you incorporate yoga in part of the integration? Or what if you also do nutritional counseling? And what if you do this and essential oils and all of these different things? And we said, those all sound great. But because we're doing research, we really have to minimize the confounding variables.
Are most people understanding of that when you try to talk to them about it? Or do they like fight the impulse to like have consistent research? Or what do you see there?
The people who want to incorporate other modalities.
Right.
Yeah. No, they're understanding of that for sure. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. It is difficult because our study is very unique. It's very rare to have a drug plus therapy. And the governmental approval system isn't really set up for regulating that unique format.
Absolutely.
So the FDA regulates how we treat our subjects. They do look at our protocols. They regulate the paperwork and the safety data we submit. And the DEA, of course, regulates everything having to do with the MDMA, where it's stored, where it came from, who administers it, taking inventory. They can show up at the study site with 24 hours notice any day of the year to audit things. But the DEA doesn't know anything about psychotherapy, really. And the FDA isn't a regulatory agency about psychotherapy either. So it's really been up to MAPS to determine what that part of the modality will be. And because we're looking for people who have clinical experience working with trauma, a lot of the people coming in to be researchers are therapists or psychologists who don't have previous experience with clinical research. So that's kind of part of our training program too, is getting them used to, this is different, where you can't just say, oh, I think this client needs this kind of treatment and this other client needs this other kind of modality. It really has to be the same general therapy we're offering to everyone.
Mm-hmm. And not everything right now is about treatment-resistant PTSD. There's other stuff too, right? Like end-of-life anxiety. I think Kyle brought that up. And are there any other subcategories?
Yeah, there's also a phase 2 study at UCLA with Charlie Grobe and Alicia Danforth. They're doing MDMA therapy for social anxiety in adults with autism. And they are on their last subject now. I think they've seen about 16 people or so. So we will have that data to analyze pretty soon. And then the phase 2 study I've been working on in Marin, California is what I mentioned earlier, the anxiety associated with life-threatening illness.
So we were kind of talking about the end-of-life anxiety study and it mostly being people with cancer. I think that's where we dropped.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, so the end-of-life anxiety and the social anxiety in adults with autism are 2 other phase 2 trials that we've done in addition to the PTSD trials. Of course, right now we're all talking about the MDMA therapy trials that MAPS sponsors, but MAPS has sponsored other trials around LSD, observational studies with ibogaine and ayahuasca. So I just wanted to give a brief mention that there is other research with other psychedelic substances. However, the MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for severe PTSD is what MAPS is pushing through the FDA pipeline so that we can really focus our efforts. We believe that if one of these modalities gets legally approved as a prescription medicine, it's going to make it a lot easier to continue to do science and to later have other modalities and other substances approved.
It's pretty logical. It seems to make sense.
Yeah. We're having kind of a friendly race with the Heffter Research Institute, which is based in Baltimore, and they do studies with psilocybin. And they also treat various different conditions, tobacco cessation, so quitting smoking, treatment-resistant depression. They also do a end-of-life anxiety study. They're doing a study with religious professionals. They're putting through phase 3 psilocybin for end-of-life anxiety.
Cool. Does it look like a similar timeline for the MAPS?
Yeah, we're both kind of analyzing phase 2 data, preparing phase 3 protocols. What is that timeline again? 3 to 5 years or something like that from now? Like 2021 is what I remember Rick saying. Yeah, that's our best estimate of when MDMA therapy could become a legal prescription medicine. This month on the 29th, so in about a week and a half, some of our clinical team and Rick are flying to DC and meeting with the FDA for our end of phase 2 meeting. That's where they go over the data. We've actually submitted our phase 2 data to the FDA, and the day before our meeting, they will send us a list of questions that they'll ask us in our meeting. The meeting is usually only an hour long. We requested if we could please get an hour and a half. It's a long way to go for an hour-long meeting. And in that meeting, we'll talk about our phase 2 data. They'll ask us questions about what more they need to see before they could picture MDMA therapy becoming a legal medicine. So obviously, phase 3 is a requirement and seeing that statistical significance. But they might also tell us other things like, we want to see what it would be like if you only did 2 experimental sessions, or we want to see safety data on this measure. We have a great working relationship with the FDA, so we already have a draft phase 3 protocol that we're showing to them, and they'll give us input. And after that meeting, we submit the protocol, and we do this ping pong with them where we do edits back and forth. And that will take a little bit of time, and we think early next year we'll have a finalized protocol approved for phase 3. After that happens, all of the facilities that will be used, so the study sites, have to be approved by the DEA. So like I said, the DEA will come in and they'll make sure that there's a safe in a locked room that has a security alarm, and they'll kind of regulate all of the aspects of drug storage and drug administration. Phase 3 for MAPS will start in about 10 to 15 sites next year. And if we do have to do that higher number of 400 study subjects, we'll do a second phase 3 that will be the second 200 people. And that would start a year later in 2018 and another 10 or so sites internationally. So all of those sites have to become DEA approved. We'll finish the therapy training program so people are trained and ready to go. Our protocol goes through IRB approval, independent review board, and they check out the ethics of how we're treating subjects, how we're recruiting them, what kind of support we're offering them throughout the study. And then we anticipate starting phase 3 in June of 2017 and starting recruitment at that time. We think that phase 3 will take about a year and a half. One of the aspects of phase 3 that is probably going to be different than phase 2, because it's a randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled study, a certain portion of the people coming into the study will get placebo, so they'll get a sugar pill instead of MDMA. And although we will have guesses about that, it's pretty obvious after about 2 hours if you're sitting with somebody who just ate some sugar or just had some MDMA. We won't officially know until phase 3 is over. And at that time, we can go back to the people who we find out did have placebo, and we can offer them to come back and have MDMA sessions because we, ethically want to make sure that everybody has access to the treatment that they're hoping for. So that will add on some time at the end of phase 3. So phase 3 will probably be done by about 2019. And then that open label part where we offer MDMA to the placebo group will take another amount of time. I don't know, maybe 6 months or so. And we can start submitting our phase 3 data to the FDA. And we'll submit our NDA, new drug application, at that time. The FDA will tell us, if there's any more information they need, if there's more studies we need to do, if they are requesting that higher number of 400 people, then that adds on a year because that second part of the study will happen a year after the first part. But yeah, 2021 is our best guess.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks for laying out that timeline. Well, I don't know. From a drug nerd perspective, it seems like there's other drugs that are a little more dangerous that get through. So it should be okay.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think it's a lot about taboo. And
right.
Rick gave a great talk one time about recreation and how recreation has been deemed evil in our society, when really it's how you bring yourself rejuvenation and keep yourself alive, and how we have creativity in life. And so any substance that's been a recreational drug, I think, gets demonized pretty severely, even if it's not chemically as dangerous as other drugs that are approved legally. I think that the skewed hypothesis is, well, those are just supposed to be used for medicines, but these are just being used for fun, and how dare you have fun with substances. And so that's kind of what's interesting about MAPS is we're very multifaceted, and the main aspect is what we've been talking about, the therapeutic uses of MDMA. Sure, people have been using them in recreational settings, but that doesn't mean that the substance in and of itself is a bad thing or doesn't have medicinal or therapeutic benefits. So we don't want to throw all the benefits out with this fear of recreational drug use. And it's not to say that people don't ever abuse MDMA. I'm sure you can, find examples. I've had people ask me, I took MDMA 50 times last year. Do you think that's too much? It's like, how does it sound to you? Does that sound like too much to you? They're like, I don't know. I guess so. And so with the therapeutic use in our studies, we only ever administer MDMA 3 times. And so we're talking about walking this fine line between what our cultural values are around medicine versus recreation. And then also showing that these substances that have been deemed evil actually have beneficial purposes.
Yeah, that's great. I was curious too to ask you about with MDMA training and MDMA becoming legal with the expanded access. Do you think you could touch a little bit base on that?
Yeah, we mentioned it a little bit earlier.
Oh, you did?
Yeah. I don't know how much else I need to say about it. It would be in a private practice setting. It would be in conjunction with phase 3. It's something MAPS would apply for after phase 3 has started, only if there's a demand for it. So if there's so many people interested in our study that we can't meet them in phase 3, which I have no doubt that is going to be true for our phase 2 studies. We had a wait list of, it was like 700 people. And our study can only recruit 24. So that part of it, I don't think is going to be an issue. There's a lot of other questions, like Joe was asking. Do they have to adhere strictly to the protocol of having 2 co-therapists and blood pressure monitoring and all of that? And we just don't know at this point. We might learn more when we meet with FDA on the 29th, but we might not even really find out about that until we go to apply for that in 2018.
Cool. Yeah. Sorry if that was a double question.
No, that's okay.
How is this working internationally? Is MAPS helping with international studies too? And are they equally as close, or are we just kind of starting with the States and then going to branch?
Yeah. Good question. So I mentioned that the first part of phase 3 will be in 10 to 15 sites. So I'll mention some of the US ones, but there are also international ones. So in the US, we're looking at Boston, New York, New Orleans, Boulder, Fort Collins, Los Angeles, the Bay Area, and San Francisco. And then we're looking at Vancouver, Montreal, Israel, and I might be missing one, but off the top of my head, that's what we've got. And so we are starting our first phase 3 with some international sites. If we do need to do those 400 study subjects, we'll have a second phase 3, like I said, that would start a year later. And that would probably be 10 more international sites. And we're looking at places in Amsterdam, Switzerland, Vienna, Austria, possibly Prague. We're checking out some locations in South America, maybe Australia. So yes, it's a very international project. And it's partly a strategic move to have studies internationally, because then it makes it easier if MDMA therapy gets approved in the US. It makes it easier to have equal recognition in other countries. So there is an international kind of coalition of medical researchers, and the governments have said, if one kind of treatment modality gets approved in your country, we will strongly consider it in our country. And it's not legally binding, like if the US approves it, everybody else has to, but it means that there could be some equivalency between them. However, each governmental agency has its own stringency about what they're looking for in research. So we're just now starting to learn more about what the EMA, the European Medical Association, would be looking for in terms of approving this. So we will learn more before we start that second phase 3.
Yeah, I wonder, nothing's happening over in Portugal, right? And you'd think like maybe with their decriminalization with drugs that things would be happening over there, like less strict with research and whatnot.
Yeah, I'm not an expert on what is happening over there, but I do know we're having 2 people come to our training, our MDMA therapy training in January, who are people who would be working with psychedelic psychotherapy. And it is interesting in Prague because maybe it's because there's not as much a motivation to go and do clinical research, which is really expensive, if you can already access substances. So that's partly it. I mean, the biggest challenge of all of this work is clinical research is very, very expensive. And who is going to fund psychedelic research? The pharmaceutical industry isn't interested in it because these are things that are in the public domain, so they can't make private money off of it. When pharmaceutical companies make a brand new drug, it's theirs. They have patents on it, and they get to claim the profits on it for quite a long time. So there's not that kind of exclusivity with psychedelic substances. There is one little clause that allows somebody about 5 years to be the only ones to offer a substance that they've done or a treatment that they've done clinical research with, even if it's in the public domain. So it's possible if MAPS approves if MAPS gets MDMA therapy approved, that we would be the only people who could train others to offer the modality for 5 years.
Huh. Interesting. Yeah. So how would that work if it does become legal? Would people be able to do it outside of MAPS through the training then?
So there's a lot of questions around this, and we don't know exactly. Because FDA doesn't regulate therapy, it's really been up to MAPS in part to define what our standards are of who can work on studies and what is the training going to consist of, and when do you say that somebody's authorized to give this kind of therapy. So that's why we really boosted up our training program to be this whole 5-part model. And it's likely that that would turn into something like a certificate program or a licensure, and, similar to going and getting a master's degree or a certificate program. You go in, and at the end of it, you can say, okay, I've been trained by this person and I'm now authorized to offer this modality. Or maybe you have to do X amount of clinical hours after that, and then you get your license. So there's a lot of questions about exactly how that could look and exactly what the requirements would be. People email us all the time. I'm entering into college now, and I want to be able to do MDMA therapy when it becomes legal, which is perfect timing because it would be like right when I graduate. Mm-hmm. So what should I pursue? And I'm like, don't ask me that. I don't know. Because it's a field that is creating itself. There's a lot of unknowns. Is the FDA later going to say, okay, now it's approved, but the only people who can offer it are licensed psychologists or psychiatrists? Or are they going to say, okay, it's approved and you just keep on training people like you've been training people? So our standard now when we're selecting people to work in the clinical research is there's always a co-therapy pair. There's a male and a female co-therapist in every session. And we ask that one of the two be a licensed mental health or medical professional. So they could be a family practice doctor, a psychiatrist, a psychologist, a marriage family therapist, a social worker, and that the other person have clinical training, preferably on a licensure path, but not necessarily. So for example, I'm a marriage family therapist intern. So I have my master's degree. I'm working on hours towards my licensure, but I don't have my license yet. So I work alongside of a psychiatrist. And one thing that's never going to change, probably, well, I shouldn't say never. One thing that's not likely to change is that the only people who can administer the drug are MDs. This is similar to other substances that therapists can't prescribe things. What's different with MDMA, though, is oftentimes when you're working in a clinic and there's therapists and social workers and doctors and nurses, the doctor can oversee the site and hand over some responsibility to the nurse or the social worker to administer a particular drug at a particular time. That's not true with MDMA. The DEA is really clear that they want to control any kind of drug diversion. They want to make sure it's directly from the doctor's hand, directly into the subject's hand, and that they see them intake it at that time. So that's one thing that could change later is if this is approved, maybe therapists can work with a doctor on site, but not necessarily in the room.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Yeah, and I think even in the training they said for the sites that don't have a psychiatrist or doctor on board, they just come and give the medicine, and then maybe they leave for a little bit and come back and check out. So it's like that team effort.
Yeah, definitely. So, I mean, but just looking generally in our culture, the people who have a lot of authority in the medical mental health field are the MDs. And then beyond that, there's kind of like this hierarchy of like people who have doctorate degrees like psychologists, and then people who have master's level degrees like MFTs and social workers. And then people who have no licenses tend to be limited in the amount of responsibility they're given. So that could be true in the future, that people with licenses will be preferred in the training program, or that people with doctorates will be. But like I said, we just don't know. And MAPS really recognizes, especially Rick, that, well, two sides to the same coin. Just because you have a license doesn't mean you're good at your job. And unfortunately, there's a lot of examples of that. And just because you don't have a license doesn't mean you don't have amazing skills to share. We see some great people who come in who have been holotropic breathwork certified, Hakomi certified. These are all certificate training programs that you can do in a year, sometimes less. You don't need to have a master's degree, and we're seeing those people are doing well. And so if we are accepting somebody like that into the program, we want to make sure that they know how to deal with a therapeutic relationship in a therapy setting, that they know how to deal with trauma, and that they're paired up with somebody who is licensed.
Great. And how do people find out more information about the therapy training program?
Yeah, there's a page on the MAPS website. So if you just go to maps.org, I'm typing in along with you. We have a place where you can sign up. So if you hit the participate tab and go down to the bottom of the screen, you'll see MDMA therapy training program. And there you can read a little bit more about the program. I mentioned that it has 5 parts. You can read about those parts on there. And there's also a little sign up where you can add your email. And this is, I'll send out updates when we know more about expanded access, when we do have training programs offered in the future. So that's just a good place. We probably won't know about expanded access until 2018, but that's just a good place where you know that when things are moving, you'll be notified.
Cool. Awesome. Thanks for that information. I'm sure that will be helpful for a lot of people that are interested in this.
Yeah.
So I'm kind of curious, too, to dive into your work with Zendo.
Yeah. So for those who don't know, the Zendo project is a psychedelic harm reduction project, part of MAPS. And we go to music festivals. We sit with people who are having difficult psychedelic experiences. We train volunteers to provide peer-to-peer counseling. And we've had so far, I think since the Zendo started in 2012, we've had about 500 or 600 volunteers, and we've served just under 2,000 guests. Burning Man is our biggest event, and we served 430 guests at Burning Man this year. We were open for a full week. We had 2 locations across the playa from each other, right next to medical. So we're feeling a lot of successes with the Zendo project. When it was started in 2012, partly co-founded by my colleague, Lene Ponte, she really had to be super PC about everything she was asking for at the event. And it's been interesting because we have to market it as harm reduction. And even though some of us personally feel like, well, what about benefit maximization? Why does it have to be this negative kind of medicalized thing? And part of the reason is because the way that music festival organizers can feel comfortable with it is if they see it as a crisis response service or as part of the safety team, which it is. One of our parts of our mission with the Zendo project is to prevent hospitalizations and arrests when they're not necessary. So without something like a safe space and people to talk to, when somebody is tripping or really high and maybe they're disturbing the people around them, the options are they either go to medical or they get taken by security. And if the event medical staff or the event security staff don't know how to deal with them, then they send them to the hospital or they call the police. So it's partly just a lack of cultural knowledge about how to deal with psychedelics and how to deal with people on psychedelics. So one aspect of the Zendo project is we provide education. So we hope that people will start to learn what they need to know about substances before they ingest them. So part of our training talks about set and setting and how to prepare yourself and how to prevent some potentially negative psychedelic experiences. But knowing that psychedelics are unpredictable, you could do all the preparing in the world. You don't really know if you're going to have a really difficult experience or totally fly off your rocker. And if you do, it's nice to know that there's a group of people who know how to take care of you and want to take care of you. So that's been a really beautiful part of working with the Zendo project. And our volunteers are super dedicated people. It's really sweet to see them come in from all different backgrounds. A lot of mental health professionals, but just a lot of peers, a lot of festival goers and travelers and students, older folks kind of wanting to give back to their community. Maybe they had experiences in the 70s, or maybe I just met a woman at Utopia, San Diego's regional burn, and she came up to the Zendo and she said, "I'm so glad you guys were at Burning Man because my daughter really needed your services, and she had a really, really hard time there. And now I'm interested in learning more about what you guys are doing. I want to know, like, how were you able to help her, and how can we help other people that are in her situation?"
So fantastic.
So yeah, just, it's so sweet to hear the success stories. And yeah, we just couldn't do it without our volunteers. The Zendo is a staff of about 3 people. The director is now Sarah Gail Giron. And we, like I said, have hundreds of volunteers. We go to about 8 to 10 festivals a year. Like I said, Burning Man's our largest, and we do Envision in Costa Rica, Africa Burn in South Africa, Boom in Portugal, which I haven't been to personally, but Sarah Gail has been there several times and works alongside Cosmic Care that provides the harm reduction there. And it is a different environment to do harm reduction in a place where drugs are decriminalized. In the U.S., there's the RAVE Act, and it makes it so that club owners and festival organizers are fearful of having harm reduction services because they could be portrayed as condoning drug use, which is explicitly illegal in the RAVE Act, and they can actually get into legal trouble if they're seen to be condoning drug use. So that's partly why we've really presented it as we work alongside the medical team. We're part of your safety unit. This is a necessary part of working with people who happen to choose to use substances while they're at your event or at your club.
Interesting. Have you ever had any hard times getting into certain festivals because they think that you might be supporting use, or?
We definitely have had hard times getting into festivals, not so much because they think we're supporting use, but because they think if they have us, that they would be seen as supporting use.
Right, yeah.
Yeah, and we're slowly making progress, or maybe quickly making progress. I mean, 2012 wasn't that long ago. So now we have festivals call us and want us to come. At Burning Man in specific, we've had amazing successes. Having 2 locations, being right next to medical. That was our first time being so close to them this year. They're providing us water and power. And so there's a lot more collaboration happening as we're developing trust. They're seeing, okay, this is peer-to-peer counseling, and these are a bunch of volunteers. They aren't part of our Burning Man organization. They're not part of our staff, but they are doing what they say they're going to do, and they are doing sufficient training, and they are triaging with security and rangers when they need to. So we've developed really good working relationships with people. Some of the commercial events have been more difficult. I mean, we've had some huge, one like 400,000 person event called us and wanted a couple of us from the Zendo project to come and just walk around their festival and kind of consult with them. And so Sarah Gail went and one of our other Zendo folks. And it's interesting because we can make our model flexible. What we do at, even a 70,000 person event, which is our biggest event, is going to have to look a lot different when you take it to an event with 400,000 people. You can't just have a tent there with 4 beds and say, right, hey, we're open for business, you know? Yeah. So we've been helping other events figure out what they can do and maybe training to offer their staff. We did our first law enforcement training this year at Burning Man. So there are other ways that Zendo is contributing to harm reduction beyond just having a physical space at events.
Interesting. And you guys just had a Zendo training in New York, right?
Yeah. Again, Sarah Gail did at the Center for Optimal Living along with Ingmar Gorman and Catherine McLean. Yeah, we're doing more trainings virtually and in person, not just at music festivals. We are developing an online training that will probably be ready next year, 2017. We do still do trainings on site for our volunteers, but also for event staff if they request that. And we have some of our live trainings recorded on our website, which is zendoproject.org.
Awesome. And again, if people want to get involved with Zendo, they could just go to the zendo.org, you said?
Yeah, zendoproject.org and click on the volunteer tab. You can fill out a volunteer profile, and that puts you on the email newsletter. We send that out about once a month, and that newsletter tells you about what events are coming up. And that gives you a chance to tell us that you're interested in that particular event, and then we'll get back to you if we're able to accept you for that event and if we have a ticket for you. Some of our events, like the commercial ones, like Lightning in a Bottle and Symbiosis, provide us with a limited amount of free volunteer tickets. And other ones that are not commercial, like Burning Man, our volunteers have to come up with their own tickets. Yeah.
Awesome. And I know most of the events are maybe on the West Coast. Do you guys do any stuff on the East Coast or have?
We did just do Catharsis on the Mall. It's a small event that happened at Washington Mall in DC. And so that was our second time going there. That was just last week. And I actually haven't heard the report back. I know it went well, but I don't know exactly how many numbers. And there's lots of interest for Zendo to come to the East Coast. So we're still exploring that.
Cool.
We want to focus a lot on having a set number of festivals that we go, and they're kind of role model events, and then really empowering others, because there's only so many events that we can do and that our staff can travel, all around the world all year long to do. So What we really want to do is mobilize other groups to get the information and knowledge and resources so that they can start harm reduction groups locally. And that's really beneficial because each community has unique needs. So when we come into a new festival, it takes us a couple of years to really figure out, like, what does this community need? What's going to work for them? How do they find out about resources? How do they access them? Do they need more like water and electrolytes and earplugs and a pat on the back? Or do they need to come in here for 8 hours and process things? And each event has its own culture. So if there are more regional groups doing that, they will be more intimately in touch with what that community needs.
Yeah, that makes sense. I just think about the resources thing. I mean, every location is so different, and it'd be really helpful to have local resources. And yeah, I guess if you're traveling all over the place, I mean, you probably don't know what's around locally.
Yeah, we do silly things like we go to Envision with a backpack full of clipboards in our file box, and we do whatever it takes, Yeah. Bringing the Zendo to South Africa.
So maybe that brings us into part of this conversation where we can talk about the future. What does everything look like a decade or two out? What kind of research might we be doing?
Well, if I was going to dream what I would like the future to look like, I would say that there's a cultural psychedelic competency that people know what psychedelics are. They're part of the cultural language. They know they have some experiences with them, either personally or through friends. There's really honest and balanced literature about it. They're portrayed in the media in an authentic way. And that people aren't afraid to talk about it. And I wanted to give alcohol as an example, but actually I think it's a terrible example. The positive aspect of how alcohol is treated in our culture is that it's talked about. People generally aren't hiding their use. Socially, it's acceptable. And we have laws about it. It's legal with certain limitations, so it protects people against some of the risks, like driving while intoxicated. But it also allows them some freedoms, like it's perfectly fine to have a glass of wine in your home if you're, But some of the downsides of that is people do still hide use and drive intoxicated, and there is still taboo around alcohol and addiction. And so maybe that's not my best example. But what I would like to see is that and I guess I would like to see it around alcohol too, is that with all substances, there's really a non-judgmental format for people to talk about their relationship with the substance. I don't believe that substances in and of themselves are evil. I think that they are tools. They are maybe power. They're a resource. And it's what we do with them that gives them a story or a value judgment. Have I seen people use psychedelics in ways that scare me or seem harmful or unhealthy? Yes. Does most psychedelic use, in my opinion, look like that? No. I've seen hundreds of people come through the Zendo, and more than that, just walking around festivals. And I think that people have real needs, and just because they've taken a psychedelic doesn't change that fact. People have needs to be protected and to be looked after. It's just what a community should do. And the needs of people while they're intoxicated specifically are different than when they're not. They're in a more vulnerable state. And so it's part of our training with the Zendo is you're dealing with people in a vulnerable state. You have to recognize power differentials and a person's sensitivity to any form of judgment, or if you have an agenda about what you're trying to get them to do, or if there's any amount of paranoia there. So I don't know exactly how to get from here to there. I think we're doing it in some ways. The science is really helpful because people who have been against psychedelic use, because they think it's an abusive relationship or unnecessary in some way, like a luxury, they're able to now look at the scientific research and say, oh, well, that's something I can talk about. I can talk about science. So it's giving people a platform to really be honest about their values, and it's giving a platform to people to change their perspective that psychedelics are either all good or all bad.
Yeah, I was kind of curious about changing that cultural perception. And I think the science is a good place to start. And I think, part of this project also is to get this information out there for people that might be in these professional roles to kind of think about this differently. I've definitely had conversations with some psychiatrists and psychologists, and tell them my interests, and they're just like, oh my God, no way. But then once you start kind of laying the foundation of the scientific research and the clinical research is coming out, it's really interesting to see how they go, wow, this is really interesting. Like, I got to look into it a little more. And they go from looking at you like you have four eyes to being a little bit more curious about, the field and what this research is all about.
Yeah. Yeah, I think there's a lot of fear still that our culture is melting away from the 70s. And that's been a good lesson for me, not having lived in the 70s, is to not overwhelm my friends and family with my psychedelic revolution.
Right.
To let people have their own choice about where they stand in any topic, including psychedelics. And to open up conversation without a need to try to convince somebody that they're good and that they should open their mind, because that just creates more resistance. Mm-hmm. And I think the best way that another way that we can make cultural change is if psychedelic users do so in a very conscientious and balanced way. And then when they do decide to disclose to friends or family that they partake, it probably won't be so shocking, and they can be role models of how psychedelic use can be part of a healthy culture and a healthy life and a balanced life.
Yeah.
Are there any discussions going on right now around polydrug use for therapeutic purposes? For instance, I know there's some kind of underground people in Mexico doing 5-MeO DMT plus other stuff, iboga for addicts. Are you aware of any data on this stuff? Are people trying to line up data that would be usable to some degree?
Yeah, I I'm curious. I'm sure there's been like safety data about polydrug use, but probably not like psychological or therapeutic data about quality of life. Yeah, you mentioned Mexico. In Mexico, 5-MeO and ibogaine are unscheduled drugs. So they're being used, not illegally, but not legally. So it is actually not illegal to use ibogaine or DMT, from my understanding of what I recently read about Mexican law. So that is really interesting. It's similar to what I said about when people ask us, well, why don't you combine yoga or nutrition or these other things with your therapy? It's like, yeah, LSD and MDMA are awesome together, but that's not what we're studying. And we don't, like I said, we also don't want to overwhelm the non-druggies with our wild drug ideas. So like to go to the FDA with, we want to give people, LSD and psilocybin and MDMA and treat their depression. It's like, I think MDMA was a really strategic choice.
Absolutely.
It's one of the younger psychedelics. So although it does have taboo around it, it has maybe less stigma than some of the ones, LSD and psilocybin from the 70s. And also because it's not a true hallucinogen. I think something about that makes it easier that people don't feel. I think people are afraid of reality distortions. Maybe there's like a fear of cult thinking or not returning to this consensual reality. So we're, baby steps.
Yeah, I can understand that for sure. And this whole idea of like cultural dissolution is, I think, something that's running rampant. Like we don't want this concept of, hardworking Americans to just fall apart to lazy drug users or something. There's a lot of confusion amongst like all these ideas, and I think people really want to preserve their identity as part of a type of culture, and this stuff poses a risk in some ways.
And I think it causes polarities. Absolutely. Because like the more that some people, I'll just use the term, wake up and think, wait, this isn't how I want to live, then maybe the more defensive or protective other groups of people are about, no, this is our life. This is our lifestyle. And of course you could, allude that to the recent election. And I think the thing that's going to make the most cultural change is how we can actually unify instead of continue to polarize each other. So it takes some real cultural creatives to figure out how to be on one side of the spectrum and find ways to bridge to the other side. Like I said, I think that the science of, we're working with people from Yale, and we're in conversations with like just, these institutions, and even people at the VA who previously were like, we don't even want to hear about MDMA, this is ridiculous, are now coming out of the woodworks like, oh, you guys are onto something. Let's collaborate. So I think it's going to be cautiously moving forward with consideration of not just what we want to create, but what is around us and what has already been created and what other people want to create.
Yeah, I think one of the genius moves is that MAPS was able to leverage tons of dollars worth of safety data that was done before and research that was done before. And that, I think, was part of that strategic decision to use this one. And it's pretty interesting to see how it's been progressing.
Yeah. I was just talking to my friend who used to be the director of development at MAPS, Virginia Wright, and she was saying in some ways MAPS is difficult to be a development director for because we don't follow any of the normal rules of like how an organization is structured or goes about getting support. But in other ways, the work speaks so much for itself. I mean, we did just get a $2 million plus grant from the state of Colorado to do our marijuana studies. But as far as the MDMA work and as far as MAPS anytime before then, for 30 years, has been all private donations. And psychedelics are something that people can get really excited about and get really behind and motivated in an active way. And phase 3 is going to cost $24 million. And we've already raised about a third of that, partly from a bequest from a previous board member and from other generous offers. And we are confident we're going to meet that. But other nonprofits without governmental support would look at that and be like, there's no possibility there, but that's not Rick's style.
He's a go-getter.
Yeah.
Something, the point about the election, do you think, not to get too political in this podcast, but do you think that there could be any roadblocks with like all this turmoil that the country is experiencing right now? Has that come up at all?
It's a good question. Yeah, we've definitely been talking about it and people have been asking us for sure. We're all like, we're all a little curious about what's about to happen. Yeah, and not quite sure, I think, like the rest of the country. Our end of phase 2 meeting, like I said, is on the 29th. So we're really curious if there will be any tone in that of what might be to come. Although, of course, the actual political transition hasn't happened yet. Rick wrote a message to the staff, and I think I can paraphrase by just saying he doesn't think it's going to be an issue with passing phase 3 forward. If there do become any roadblocks because of this administration, it would be later when we actually go to apply for an NDA. It's politically easier to get science approved than it is to get policy changed. In order for MDMA to become a legal prescription medicine, the DEA would be required to reschedule it from Schedule 1 to either 2 or 3. So if the FDA approves it, the DEA is mandated to make one of those changes. And that whole process will be influenced by whoever the administration is.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I think supporting the whole thing with extra media, especially stuff related to VA, endorsement or otherwise, I don't know, interest, could really, over the course of months and years, build a nice stable platform, politically, rich platform to lead from. Because, MAPS does a great job with media. And I think just, building that over time and having, a lot of allies, just keeping crewing allies will hopefully be part of the saving grace at the end of the process. There's plenty of time left.
I had a dream a couple nights ago that I was at some event and I was like taking an Uber or car to get home, and I was sharing a car with somebody, and I got in and it was Michelle Obama. And in the dream, she had 2 sons. I know she really has 2 daughters. And her 2 sons were there. We were just chatting, and I knew it was Michelle Obama, but it was a casual chat while we were on our way towards home. And we were talking about diversity, which is something we've been talking about at MAPS too. That's another site that we might work with, is potentially the University of Connecticut, with somebody who specializes in racial trauma, who's been through our training program.
Cool.
But anyways, Michelle and I were talking about diversity and just all the things happening in our political world right now. And then we were getting closer to her home. Oh, and then I was in her home for a moment, and I didn't want to take up her time. And I was kind of aware that, it was late at night. And I said, I just want to ask you one thing, and then I'm going to be on my way. But have you heard of any of the MDMA assisted psychotherapy work with PTSD? And she said, yeah, I've heard of that. And I said, yeah, I work with MAPS, and we're really trying to figure out how to bring in diversity. And in addition to that, we just see that trauma is a major theme in our country right now. And she said, yeah, I heard about that. I'm glad to keep hearing more about it, and I'd like to know more. And then I said, okay, well, I've got to say goodnight. And I had the sense when I said goodbye to her that I was going to be seeing her in 4 years as the president. So I just thought that was cool. And I do think that the message is getting out there so far that people you maybe wouldn't have expected, or maybe 10 years ago wouldn't have expected, are knowing about this work. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
That's a really hopeful dream. Thanks for sharing that.
Realistically, I'm sure MAPS has some connections, 1 to 2 people away with the Obamas, and, come January, maybe they really actually want to hear about it in person. Maybe if it's just Michelle even, because she is able to influence a lot.
That'd be cool.
Yeah.
I thought about writing to her, whoever, her secretary or something, about my dream.
Should.
Yeah, I think it's a great idea.
See where it gets you.
So we're over an hour. I think we hit most of the stuff we planned to talk about, but was there anything maybe additionally you wanted to chat about, like resources for students to try to figure out their path forward or anything?
Yeah. I'll make a couple of mentions. Cool. Because we are contacted by so many people, students and professionals, family members who really want to know how to contribute to this work and how to pursue a career in the psychedelic field. Like I said, we are co-creating this field right now. And so while there are things that MAPS is putting together, like I mentioned, our co-therapy model and the prerequisite experience we're looking for, there are also a lot of unknowns about what it can be. So it's actually, even though it's a confusing time for somebody who kind of wishes there was more structure and a path that was clear, it's also an amazing time to create a path, because there is so much potential that we can actually be a part of shaping what this field looks like in generations to come. And I'm reminded of, like, my friend was like, well, the APA, the American Psychiatric Association, they haven't existed forever. One day they were a group of people doing this kind of work, and they thought, we can create standards for our field, and we can create a path for our field. And this is how you get licensed, and this is how you get approved, and this is how you get supervision. And we'll have conferences, and we'll have certificate programs. And, so it could be like that in the future. It's like we are that group now, and it's kind of hard to realize that at this point. We, I think, are so used to other people having the structure prepared for us and telling us what we should be doing. So it's a blessing and a curse for anybody who's looking to pursue this. I definitely recommend people look at what they're really skilled at and interested in, because it's not just psychotherapy. It's chemists creating the compounds and testing variations of the compounds and better ways to make them. And MAPS just ordered a kilogram of good manufacturing practice, GMP, MDMA. It's a different standard of making MDMA that you have to have for phase 3 studies. So for our phase 2 and 1 studies, we used MDMA that was high quality, but it wasn't completely regulated and regimented by the DEA every step of the way. So chemists, we spent months looking for a statistician who could process our data in specifically the way that we were looking for. There's people writing books. There's people creating integration programs. There's people running conferences. There's people running retreat centers for holotropic breath work or for post-integration after people have had psychedelic experiences. So there's psychedelic artists, there's psychedelic dancers, there's, like, you name it, you just put the word psychedelic in front of it. And so I really recommend that people network as much as possible, that they connect with other people who share this common interest, that they come to events. We're having the Psychedelic Science Conference in April 2017 in Oakland, California. Tickets are on discount right now. It's still early bird. And even when you come to the conference, you can see that widespread field. You can see vendors selling jewelry that appeals and artists there. And you can see all the academics and the scientists, and you see all the clinicians and the therapists. And it's really cool to see how much is possible. And if you are a student in college, I definitely recommend connecting with SSDP, Students for Sensible Drug Policy, as one way to network. If your school doesn't already have a chapter, consider starting one. And DPA, Drug Policy Alliance, has events. They sometimes have regional events. are a great organization to be in touch with as well, especially if you're interested in more of the legal aspects, or if you're interested in learning what you can do to move policy forward in this country around drugs. Those are some of the examples. Yeah.
Cool. MAPS also has an article on the website from David Nichols, I think, giving advice to students. Just doing as good as you can in school and trying to go to the top schools you can get involved with, and just kind of builds momentum that can stick with you. Yeah, it's really it's a really interesting place. There's so many organizations, and we're all making it together right now, and that's what this show is. That's what you're doing with MAPS, and there's no reason we can't have more organizations to fill more needs. Yeah.
And, I'll mention again, the Zendo project is a great way to volunteer. It's one of the rare opportunities to work with people on a psychedelic substance. Even in our training program, we can't do that. So I highly recommend that for people who want to get a feel for what would it be like to sit with somebody who's having an experience. Is that really something I'm interested or good at, or how can I get skills around that? And I'm working on posting a resource on the Zendo website of other groups that do harm reduction. There are other groups in the US and, of course, all around the world. So if you are living in an area that the Zendo isn't doing events, you can connect with one of those groups.
Awesome. Thank you. And if people want to reach out or get in touch with you, how would they find you?
Yeah, they can email me, Shannon@maps.org, SHANNON, and come see us at the Psychedelic Science Conference, and come to Zendo events, where either I will be there or my coworker, Sarah Gale.
Awesome. Thanks so much. This has been an awesome chat and really great resources and everything. I really appreciate your time with us.
Yeah, it's been really fun.
Thank you, Kyle and Joe.
Yeah, thanks.